Thank you very much. My name's Eric Beecher and I'm here to interrogate Robert Manne, which is going to be an interesting task, about his new quarterly essay called Bad News. It's an extraordinary work in lots of ways, having read it, but particularly because this is a major piece of research and writing into a single newspaper. And its approach and its points of interest are about the influence that this newspaper has on our society. It's not a history of the newspaper, it's not a profile of the newspaper, it's about how one newspaper impacts the politics and the issues and events of an entire country in ways that Robert questions and raises, I think, quite serious doubts about. So I guess my starting point, Robert, is The Australian is a newspaper with a tiny circulation, Monday to Friday about 100,000 circulation in a country of 22 million, much smaller than virtually every other metropolitan daily newspaper in this country, including papers like the West Australian or the Courier Mail. It largely preaches to a kind of converted audience. I think everyone who buys or reads The Australian has a sense of its ideological and political alignments, and it often overreaches, which is part of its, I guess, charm in some ways. So why is The Australian so important and worthy of an entire quarterly essay?
I think for a number of reasons. If I can just go through some. One is I think it's the paper that what I call the political class more or less compulsorily has to read. And I mean by that politicians, senior public servants, both federal and state, and what I would call most of the activist citizens who are really engaged in politics. I think they read it. Even if they loathe it, they kind of know they have to. I think it's the only paper that's national, a general paper that's national, so that in smaller states, an intelligent readership, let's say in Brisbane, has the choice between the Courier Mail and the Australian. In Perth, the West Australian, which is one of the few non-Murdoch-owned papers, or the Australian. So it tends to have a dominance for the serious, those who seriously want a kind of broadsheet paper. The other thing I think is very important is that most papers, including the Fairfax papers, seem to me, even if you can say they have a slightly left of centre kind of feel to them, don't have an ideology and don't have a kind of agenda that they're pushing. And I think a great strength, as it were, strength in terms of cultural analysis of the Australian is that it knows what it wants Australia to be, and it knows where it stands. And it stands, in essence for what I call market fundamentalism. And every major problem can be solved by market forces. And it's extremely pro-American and believes in American global hegemony. But it knows and it's very hostile to the left, which it regards as monstrous, to moral relativism, which it defines in a certain way, hostile to modern university humanities. So, knowing what you want to do and having a very clear ideology gives you a strength against a more pluralist competitor. And so, and it also is very, it takes apart those it perceives as its enemy, which is the Fairfax Press and the ABC, and to some extent your publication, Crikey. So I think for all that combination of reasons, I think it has an enormous impact on the national political culture. And in my main claim is if you want to understand power in Australia, you can't do an analysis which leaves the Australian out.
So if it does matter to that extent, and if it does set the national agenda to that extent, I mean, what does that say about the state of our democracy, that such a small circulation, in some ways quite unusual organ, has so much influence on policy and society?
Well, I think it's quite alarming. I mean, there's nothing you can do about the fact that the Australian exists, and nothing you can do about the fact that the Australian, after September 11, gave its editorship to a very ideological person, Chris Mitchell. There's nothing anyone can do about that. But I'm extremely worried about the fact that it has a kind of leadership role amongst the Murdoch press in Australia, which controls 70% of major newspapers. And I think it's now got to a position, and I've thought this for a long time, that if that 70% of the press, which then feeds radio and television, decides that it's hostile to a government and decides that it will campaign against a government, as I think it does, so the Herald Sun, especially the Daily Telegraph, follow the lead of the Australian, and I think follow the lead of their boss, Murdoch, or their owner, Murdoch, I think we're in very dangerous territory. I think at the moment there is a kind of informal decision that the people at News Limited made, that they think the minority government, Gillard, in alliance particularly with the Greens, needs to go. I think that's what they think. They won't say it, but that's what I think they think, and I produce some evidence in the quarterly essay. I think that if they make that decision and then begin to campaign against the government, and that feeds into radio and television, I think we're in dire straits. And I don't know what to do about it. I've got suggestions, and I know we slightly differ on that question, but I think democracy is under threat. I have to say, I think it was a very big mistake that Paul Keating, one of the politicians I most admire when he was Treasurer, allowed that situation to happen. And indeed, you were the editor of one of the papers after it happened, which was to hand over this 70%.
And you were a columnist.
And I was a columnist. Strangely enough, I think my first or second editor as a columnist was Andrew Bolt. Anyhow, I think democracy is in danger in Australia for that reason. I think now it's almost certain the Gillard government will be swept from power in the next election. I think everyone sees that. And one of the factors, not the only factor at all, but one of the factors is the anti-democratic control that the Murdoch newspaper, led by the Australian, has over public opinion here.
So in terms of the Australians, to the extent that you can define it, it's sort of precise influence on the agenda and outcomes in this country. You're saying it's a kind of a cascading effect, that although it's very small in its own right, given the kind of people who read it, including the rest of the media, but also the opinion leaders and political leaders, and secondly, because it's at the heart, if you like, of the Murdoch organisation in Australia, it has this kind of spiralling effect.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Plus, I think you'd find that a lot of, even ABC radio reads the Australian every morning, and it helps us set their agenda. I think even a program as good as Radio National's breakfast program, which is the sort of paper of the the radio program of the intelligentsia, and a very good program, I think even they are influenced. And there's another thing that we haven't said yet. I've been told by politicians, the only one who would go on record is Bob Brown, but I've been told by many other politicians who I interviewed, very, very senior, that the Australian has a very heavy influence within the press gallery in Canberra. Bob Brown said that when he gives a press conference, about half of the people usually come from the Australian. Some stay away because they just get so sick of the kind of aggressive attack upon Bob Brown, led by, it's Dennis Shanahan, who doesn't always turn up, but Matthew Franklin and others who just go at him and go at him. And then they produce news, they twist what he says in order to produce the story that they already, I suspect, have been told from Sydney to get. And then, I make an admission. To some extent, I think towards the last days of the Rudd government, I was influenced by the way they were running campaigns. When I think back, we might talk about this later, on the mining tax, the degree to which they kind of attacked the government for what they were doing, the remorselessness of it, or the other campaigns they were running, particularly building educational revolution programs, I think affected everyone. And I don't think any other news organisation, certainly not the ABC or Fairfax, runs things in that manner. So I think it is a cascading effect. And I think in the end the culture is shifted, or the political culture is shifted because of the way it behaves.
But is there another side to this coin? I mean, what about the rest of the serious media, particularly the print media, but also the ABC, that they, I guess by definition from what you're saying, have vastly less influence?
Yes.
Yet, you know, there are more of them in numbers. There are more other newspapers. There are 3 major quality Fairfax newspapers. There's the ABC. How do they fit into this?
Well, each has to be looked at separately. In my view, the ABC has, since the Howard government, been on the defensive. A very long campaign has been run to say they are dominated by the left. And in some ways it was true before the mid-90s. But I think they're very fearful now of appearing to be what their enemies say they are. So the ABC, I think, has bent over backwards not to be perceived as following a line. I think Fairfax, or the 2 things to say about Fairfax simply. One is that I think it's slightly all over the place now. I think, for example, the Sydney Morning Herald has drifted rightwards since the mid-90s, and I think now the balance of its columnists are no longer left liberal, as they once were. And I think they're also competing against, to some extent, they're not subsidised like the Australians, so they have to stay afloat, and no one knows more about the difficult financial position of both Sydney Morning Herald and The Age than you. They have to keep afloat. They compete to some extent against Daily Telegraph and Herald Sun, and they have become lifestyle-y papers, in a way not as concentrated on those serious elements that an intelligentsia wants to read about. So they've kind of lost their focus, and they, I think, have drifted rightwards as the political culture has. So they just don't have the same clout, I think, as Murdoch, led by the Australian, has.
So are you saying there's a kind of passivity about the rest of the serious media versus the Australian, which is an activist newspaper, always running with big issues? You're never in doubt where they stand on things, both in the news pages and in the op-ed pages?
Yeah, that's what I am saying. I'm saying it for 2 reasons. The broader reason is the one I've already said, that they are diverse, pluralist in their worldview. They don't have a line, which to some extent is refreshing, although, I think they could be clearer about where they stand. But the other part of the passivity, which really does astonish me, is that if you read the Australian closely, as I do and I think you do, all the time Fairfax and the ABC is lampooned by the Australian. It's one of their stock kind of the ingredients of their agenda. And I've been very puzzled as to why Fairfax and the ABC turn the other cheek, sort of almost ignore that this is going on, because I think it does weaken them amongst the political class. Everyone gets one of my favourite sayings comes from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said slander is a hummable tune, that slanders catch on. Even if you don't sort of originally agree with them, the story gets going. And the slander against Fairfax and the ABC, that they're in the hands of mad Soviet-style leftists, the Age is the Spencer Street Soviet and all that. Those lines eventually, even for people dubious, have their effect. So why haven't they stood up? And I say one of the things, there's an old joke which I like very much, which there's a joke about myself really, is that one can't argue, an individual can't argue with anyone who buys ink by the barrel. It's one of the oldest jokes about journalism. But Fairfax buys ink by the barrel, and the ABC has is on wavelengths which are an equivalent. And I do wish they'd take up the battle and not sort of be so passive in regard to what the Australian tries to do to them and position them.
I mean, maybe, this is a comment, not a question, but maybe one of the reasons for that is that my observation, and I read the Australian every day, that's the first newspaper I read, and I read several, is there's no other newspaper like this in the world, by which I mean that actually runs agendas against its competitors as openly and regularly
yes.
Anywhere in the world. So if you're on the receiving end of that, mind you, it's been going on for quite a few years, how do you react to that? It's not like there's a playbook for this.
That's true. The other thing is that normal people don't like fights. They actually like to live a quiet life. They like to take pride in what they do professionally. They know that if they tangle with the Australian, it gets dirty and bloody. And I think most people naturally try and avoid it. It's, what my wife always says, that bullies have a natural advantage. They don't necessarily win, but they have an advantage in that they, quieter, more decent people, slightly want to avoid fights with them. I'll give an example just in my personal case. I've told a number of people, including close friends, obviously, that I'm doing a quarterly essay on the Australian. And it eventually occurred to me they react as if I've told them that I have a fatal disease. And the way they look is to say, do you know what you're in for? Like, do you know what radiotherapy does to you or chemotherapy? I think there's a very general sense that to tangle with the Australian is to take a very big risk, and you have to be slightly mad to do it. Everyone knows that it's a really quite seriously bullying style. And for that reason, I think what Fairfax and the ABC have tended to say is we're not going to lower ourselves to that level. But I think that's to some extent a rationalisation for we don't want to tangle with someone who will remorselessly go at us and will enjoy it in a way that we won't.
But you say people don't want to tangle with the Australian, and I largely agree with that. And yet, in the past few days, we've seen the Prime Minister of the country in a way that almost I can't ever recall somebody in that position tangling with a newspaper, The Australian. And The Australian this morning, I don't know if you read the story on the front page, did a reconstruction of what happened, the phone calls from the Prime Minister in which John Hartigan and Chris Mitchell claimed that she was hysterical and screaming at them and this sort of thing, and her officers denied that, and they've reconstructed the whole thing. So you have a situation, and the result of it was within hours of publication, The Australian published this grovelling apology and withdrew the article from their website, and in the next day's paper published it twice.
Yes.
So someone there is tangling with them, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, I think what's happened, I think, this is my construction, that one minister in the Gillard government, Stephen Conroy, had enough. And before that, Bob Brown had enough. But when Stephen Conroy was the victim of one of the campaigns, which is on the National Broadband Network, and he could see at first hand how it all worked, he had enough. And I think he probably has been trying to get the cabinet to see what's going on for quite a while. And his sense is, and he's used this very publicly, that they are about regime change. And he's particularly worried that a meeting at Carmel that happened in either late April, early May this year, where most of the editors and some of the very senior News Limited journalists met with Rupert Murdoch, that they discussed. And the way they put it, I think, is that there is a political danger for Australia to have a minority government which relies on the Greens in the Senate. And for the good of the country, something needs to be done about it. And then they think that a very important moment happened when the very close friend and 2IC at the Australian, Paul Whittaker, moved from the Australian earlier this year to the Daily Telegraph. And then G'd up the Daily Telegraph. Now very important, because if New South Wales goes, then Labor goes. And I think there's a real alarm inside the cabinet. But they're in this position where if they don't take them on, they may just quietly go to their demise. If they do take them on, there's an astonishing risk that, what happened, I haven't read it, but what you tell me happened this morning, that the Australian and the Daily Telegraph and Herald Sun, less the Herald Sun actually, more the Daily Telegraph, will do them slowly. And this is what our session is called, Power Without Responsibility. You'll never unelect the Daily Telegraph or the Australian, but you will unelect a government. And so, the press can do whatever they want without sort of real fear of reprisal or consequence, whereas a government can't be like that. And I think it's a really critical moment in our democracy, I have to say. It's partly why I've written this essay, because I think at least people have to become aware of the size of the problem we now face.
So to pick up on that issue of power or power without responsibility, in the essay you look at the coverage by the Australian and some other News Limited publications of the war in Iraq, And you write that all 175 of Murdoch's newspapers around the world supported the war in Iraq, which is a known fact, it's been published before. But that you discovered during a trip to Tasmania, and this was news to me, that during a trip to Tasmania, that for a brief time in 2002, the Hobart Mercury, which is owned by News Limited in Australia, wrote anti-war editorials, but that, and I quote you, that it towed the Murdoch line only after a warning letter came from News Limited's Australian head office. Yeah. So in terms of media power, you know, this is quite spine-chilling stuff.
Yes.
So how typical do you think this is of the way that News Corp or News Limited here works?
Well, I discovered this was interesting because I was, at the time, was 2003, I think. At the time, I was very concerned with the question of Wind Shuttle and the way the Australian had made Wind Shuttle into a central figure. I was talking to a journalist at the Hobart Mercury about the Australian and Wind Shuttle. I can't say who it was. It's like most of these things, people are secretive. So I'll say he. He went silent, almost white, and said, "Look, I've got to tell you a story," and told me this story, that this person knew the story from the inside. So one of the big questions is how far Rupert Murdoch dominates the agenda of his papers. And I think on the war in Iraq, it was for him a really important issue. And he had the view, not only bought all the nonsense about Saddam Hussein having WMD, what we now know as nonsense. He believed the price of oil would go down to $20 a barrel and it would be a great thing. And he just openly said, our papers, that means 175 major papers, support American foreign policy. I think actually, strangely enough, on climate change, he's lost control of his empire. So it doesn't always follow. He sort of, for a moment at least, took climate change seriously. It's said because of James Murdoch, and he wanted his whole empire to become carbon neutral, and he to some extent tried to get his papers to see things that way. But he doesn't control that issue. I think because it doesn't mean enough to him. But Fox News is the engine of anti-climate change action in the United States, and in my view, the Australian is the engine against climate change action in Australia. So I think it's very sinister that someone as powerful and as ideological as Murdoch can dominate so much of the way we see the world in Australia. But it's inconsistent as to how far he wields that influence. I mean, talking to you is funny because you were actually one of his editors on Herald, when the Herald was re-established in Melbourne as a serious paper. So you know more about the subject than me. But anyhow, that's my view, that it's a bit inconsistent as how far he dominates. But on things that mattered to him, like Iraq, he really did.
Yeah, I think from my own experience and then thinking about the coverage of the war in Iraq, I mean, to me, there is a very common theme there in Rupert Murdoch's intervention, if you like, or making his views very strongly known. Because the way the organisation works, it may be different now. He's 80 years old. He's confronting some very serious governance and other legal issues, and he's trying to keep the family dynasty going. And so things I suspect, are quite different now. And it's a much bigger organisation. Yes. And newspapers are a much smaller part of that organisation. But I was editor there for 2 years, from 87 to 89, and that included the financial crash of 87. And Rupert was here in Melbourne when that happened, and we had offices next to each other. And his first reaction there, and I'm relating this to his attitude to the war in Iraq, was essentially about the stability of the economic system, and particularly the US. And I think this is the other thing. And so he said to us, the editors, what's really important, this was the day that the markets crashed in 87, he said, what's important is that we've got to maintain a line that supports the financial systems and economic stability. That's really important. These things happen. And then the next day he came in and he repeated that, and he said, I've just talked to the president about it, which was Ronald Reagan, and I've assured him that we're supporting that line. And so I think that when it comes to, if you like, American interests or the US government's interests, which clearly was the case with the war in Iraq.
Yes.
I think that's a kind of line that never gets crossed.
Yes. I mean, I have in the quarterly essay a simple fact, which is that Tony Blair phoned Rupert Murdoch 3 times in the 2 or 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq. I mean, it was Tony Blair phoning Murdoch, not Murdoch phoning Tony Blair. And I don't know what was said. Presumably they were discussing how the Murdoch press would handle the invasion in some way. So that, his closeness to Anglo-American interests is extraordinary. I didn't know the story about ringing or talking about having spoken with Reagan.
It's a bit of a scoop, Robert.
The Australian can run it on Monday.
Another issue that you look at very closely in the quarterly essay is climate change. And I was intrigued and impressed to see how assiduous you were, but I know what a great academic you are, so I wasn't surprised. But in order to assess the balance of the Australians' coverage of climate change under Chris Mitchell's editorship, you read all of the Australians' articles, all of them, about climate change published between January 2004 and April 2011, hundreds and hundreds of them, excluding, I should say, letters to the editor and stories that were published in advertising supplements. And of the 880 articles which you were able to categorise as either favourable or unfavourable to climate change action, 180 were favourable and 700 were unfavourable, a 4-to-1 ratio. And then when you drill down into stories written by scientists on the subject that they'd commissioned, the ratio rose to 10-to-1. So again, going back to this theme, I mean, how much impact do you think the Australians' coverage of that particular subject has had on Australians, directly or indirectly?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. Just say about your analysis, you left out that I also separated out the editorials and did that as a separate bit of analysis. How influential? I think it's been profoundly influential in that the political class reads The Australian and its opinions filtered in the way which we've already described down into other parts of the media and thus the public. To take action on climate change is very difficult. It's painful. It's not a simple matter. It's a very difficult matter to do. And the only way I think it can happen is if common sense and honesty dominate. And the honest position is that virtually every climate scientist thinks there's a core consensual position. To create uncertainty about that, to say it's an open question, we don't know, science is not settled, which is essentially in 100 ways the Australian, that's the line they've run, I think means that societies and vested interests, in this case mainly the fossil fuel interests, but also many other interests that rely on energy, which most do, it gives them a way out. There's enough uncertainty now about the area in Australia. I have to say, even amongst my more conservative friends, who I thought to be highly intelligent, they've been influenced by the sense that the science is not settled. Maybe the scientists have got their hand in the pockets of research bodies, and so on and so forth. I think the climate change issue is the most important issue we face. I think it's always going to be very difficult to act because it's not comfortable, it's painful. And if you can create a sense both of confusion about the science and about the possible vested interest of scientists, and thus strike a blow against the whole reign of science and reason, you've done a very, very damaging and dangerous thing. And I think the Australian, if anything, that's to me what drove me to write this essay more than any other issue. I think the Australian has achieved that, to muddy the waters. The only question is whether it's done because those who run the paper are stupid, or whether it's done because they want to deceive, because they act in the interests of big business. It's a very interesting question to me as to what the true answer to that is.
Well, that's right, and really I think the heart of not just how they cover climate change, but why the Australian is such a activist, engaged newspaper on big issues. Why? And I'm going to give my view in a minute because I have a view about this, but in the case of either climate change, which you just talked about, or more broadly, why are they doing this?
Yeah, that's. I think you have to have a complicated explanation. In part, I think they don't think clearly. You know, I've read 300 editorials they've written, and they're an incredible intellectual confusion on central issues. I'm going to just say one. Science is not settled, they say. Because there is disagreement on certain questions among scientists, there's disagreement as to at what pace will the poles melt, or the continental ice shelves melt. There is disagreement. You can't predict these things for certain. On the consensual core, there's no difference. They confuse those two things, so they create that confusion. An intellectual muddle goes all through their editorials, which are sort of dictated by Chris Mitchell every morning. He tells press conference the line, then their editorial writers like Chris Kenny, Helen Trinker, go out and write it, then they come back and he looks at it, and he takes it very seriously. I think there's great intellectual muddle. But I think there's also astonishing prejudice against this hydra-headed monster, as I call it, the left. And the left now includes scientists, which is an amazing construct. But the left now it believes in climate change and it wants to destroy capitalism. It's a sort of old Cold War mentality, which I know because I was involved in that same side in the Cold War. It's the old Cold War mentality applied to questions of climate change. So views of this sort are politically correct, the new term, and political correct views are dominating even scientists. So there's that. And then there is the persistent pressing issue of business, which I think they have very close connections, particularly to mining interests. And to other forms of business that rely on low energy prices. So I think the only explanation I can give is these three things: intellectual muddle, ideological prejudice, and then, as it were, being answerable to big economic interests play together into what causes it.
Well, I look at it differently, as you know, and I think that there are other factors that really drive a newspaper, including the Australian, to do what they do, and they do it on a much more obvious scale than anyone else. The first thing is newspapers like that want to set the agenda. They want to be seen to be setting the agenda. There's no more gratifying moment for the editor of a newspaper like that to have campaigned or run hard on an issue that no one else is running hard on, that then moves into the public domain and, gets politicians talking and gets raised in Parliament, gets the other media following. And I don't think there's any doubt that both at the Australian and News Limited and News Corp overall, and they're quite public about this, that they're in the business of setting agendas and having everybody else follow them. And that's both driven editorially and I think commercially.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, well, I'm asking the questions, Robert, so you can.
To confirm what you say, I mean, I knew this was your view, and I had this strange experience when I asked to interview Chris Mitchell for the quarterly essay, and he said not only yes, but you also can interview 8 other people, I think. One of whom was Clive Matheson, the editor. The editor is one under editor-in-chief. Clive Matheson said exactly what you're saying, which is we want to be noticed. He calls it elbows out style. We want, to hit people or for them to hit us. We want to set agendas. And the paper has become much more agenda setting than it used to be under, say, Paul Kelly in the 90s. I think that's true. On the other hand, you ask a simple question. Well, you would be noticed if, for example, you said that Australia has to begin to phase out the coal industry, as much noticed as climate change is a fraud. Now, it seems to me my analysis shows why it's inconceivable that they would say, that, what I would say actually, that you have to begin to think about Australia's coal industry in a serious way if you take climate change seriously. In other words, I think there might be a way of bridging our analyses by not disagreeing with what you say, but by looking at why the particular agenda that they've set in this area, which also other Murdoch places like Fox News have said, which is very common in the United States, why that agenda has particularly interested and even excited them.
Yes, but you see, I think that what's going on here is that it's one of the points you just made. I think it's also aligned to wanting to be noticed all the time, you know, especially on every story on the front page and editorials and so on, is this issue about the fact that they want to be noticed in a kind of singular way. And they know exactly the position that their competitors are going to take. And indeed, they're not only their media competitors, but if you like, their ideological competitors, which is a bit like, you know, my enemy's friend is my enemy. And so I think that gets woven into the frame as well. But, you know, as you were talking, I mean, it struck me that surely you'd have to say that their desire to be noticed has been, you know, vindicated and is hugely successful. I mean, you've written a whole quarterly essay on them.
Yes, I know. I agree. See, I think the difference between you and me, Eric, and I have great admiration for you in many ways.
Here we go.
Why are you laughing? It's serious. I mean, I asked if, when there was a possibility of doing this session, I asked that Eric do it for that reason, partly because, you know, we don't see the world exactly the same way. In my view, what has happened since, you know, maybe the mid-90s or a bit earlier, is a worldview has formed over what I call neoconservatism and neoliberalism. It has, neoconservatism is in both foreign policy and moral terms, neoliberalism is in the economy. And I think it came out of American conservatism. It's come here via that channel. I think the Murdoch empire is the major Anglophone promoter of this very particular worldview. And the difference between us is that I see the world more as driven by ideology, in a way that often people don't understand. Whereas I think you're a more pragmatist and you see commercial interests and empirical matters as kind of more moving forces than I do. So I mean, I don't think we can resolve it here. It's a very big difference, and I don't think it's, you know, I think you could integrate both our perspectives into some overall view.
Yeah, look, I don't think we're in violent disagreement, but I think one of the differences, if you like, is that I see things through the perspective of my own professional background, which has been as a newspaper editor and now publisher. But as a newspaper editor, I know what it's like to go into the office every morning and figure out what you do. And people might think, oh, well, that's just covering the news. You know, what's news? You know, send reporters out, cover the news, find someone to give an enlightened opinion on it and go home. But these days, particularly, and it was the case when I was a newspaper editor some time ago, but even more so now, the intensity of both competition in the media marketplace and the unravelling of the business model of particularly quality newspapers, so a paper like The Australian essentially makes no money, is driven by those factors as well.
Yes.
I think, in fact, mainly those factors. And then you overlay that, I think, and you've mentioned this in the essay and talked about it before, that in the case of The Australian, you have a newspaper that is not run for commercial reasons. I mean, they need to keep control of the budget, but it probably has more journalists and a bigger editorial budget than almost any other newspaper, yes, I suspect. I mean, there are no public figures available on that. And that's because its proprietor and its owner, the organisation that owns it, is prepared to have this newspaper, as they have the Times in London, out there for non-commercial reasons. And therefore, that vests a different kind of power, if you like, in the editor. And then you overlay that with the fact that The Australian has an editor who's been there for quite a long time by normal standards of the life cycle of editors, who has very, very strong views about a lot of things, but particularly about the positioning of his own newspaper.
Yeah, but in a way you've fallen into my case. Because if you ask the question, it's an interesting matter. The Australian is not a commercial enterprise. Here you have, it's such a paradox that it's almost painful to have to point it out. Here is a paper whose central sort of claim is the market rules okay, and which is, by any market standards, would almost certainly collapse if it had to make, had to make money. It's enormously subsidised. I'm sure, even though the figures are opaque, but nevertheless, I think everyone I've spoken to has the same view. Even in a way, Chris Mitchell kind of admitted it when we spoke. Then the question is, why does Rupert Murdoch subsidise this paper in the way he does? And I think the answer is, I think there are two parts to the answer. One is he cares about Australia, and it's his way of influencing the trajectory of his country. He has a paternal interest in dominating here, sort of minor, sort of part of his empire, but nevertheless the one where he was born, so he feels especially responsible to make sure we do the right thing. And doing the right thing, he is a very ideological man. He looks practical and pragmatic, but he has a fiercely held worldview, comprising, as I say, the dominance of America over the world is a good thing, and markets should rule, okay. And I think he sees the Australian as a way in which, not to make money at all, but sees the Australian a way in which, for this country that he feels, some sort of responsibility, will fall into line with his what looks practical, but is in fact a very particularly ideological view. Can I say, I know one of your great columnists in Crikey is Guy Rundle, is also a friend of mine. He captured in a show a while back when Murdoch was thinking about this little outpost down here that he cares about. And he did it almost as Chairman Murdoch, as a Chairman Mao figure, thinking about what should happen down here. And that's the way I do think it works. But that is not a commercial explanation. It's an ideological explanation.
If we could go back to the quarterly essay, because there are a couple of other points I'd like to raise. The Indigenous debate. Now, this is a little bit of or maybe a big bit of a paradox here, the way the Australian covers Indigenous Australia. And in looking at its role in that debate, you say, the Australian has played a vital role in alerting the general public to the breakdown of conditions of life in the remote Aboriginal communities, not only in the Northern Territory, but across the country. And you mention the Australians' role in giving Noel Pearson a permanent forum for his views. So doesn't this role in one of the country's most important and vexed issues not only reflect admirably on the Australian, but even more so compared with the performance in this debate by almost every other media outlet?
To some extent. I agree with that, and what you've quoted is what I believe. I see it as slightly more complicated than just praising them. There's no doubt, and I first encountered Chris Mitchell really over this issue in a serious way, because I wrote the first quarterly essay, In Denial, about the stolen generations. He got his wife at the time to write an almost 8,000-word article attacking me in the Courier Mail, which he edited at the time. Then he started ringing me and saying, go to the remote Aboriginal communities at Cape York and I'll pay. And go with Noel Pearson and actually Anna Bligh. It was really interesting. And so I went. And it was clear to me that he did care. As a Queenslander, he always says, I care about these matters. Ivory Tower academics like you don't get it, blah, blah, blah. And there's no doubt that the reporting on Indigenous matters by Tony Kosh, terrific journalist from Queensland, by Nicholas Rothwell, one of the great non-fiction writers of Australia, so on, has been important. All of that conceded, and no other paper gives anything remotely like the attention the Australian does to Indigenous matters. And I think Noel Pearson is a fundamentally important intellectual force. My worry is twofold. One is there are other ways of looking at things, and I think the paper doesn't record them. It holds out other Aboriginal Indigenous intellectuals, so you get a rather skewed view from the paper that takes the issue most seriously. It's what I call univocalism, which I think is unhealthy. Even more, it distorts how Indigenous people are feeling about what's happening to them through government policy. I'm almost certain that a very large number, and most likely a majority of Aboriginal people, are very unhappy with aspects of the intervention, the federal intervention. But you would not know if you read The Australian. And if indeed you say that, they fall upon you, as they did with Larissa Barrett, which is one of the things I deal with in the essay. But so I think they have done an admirable job in keeping these questions in front of people's minds, in giving Noel Pearson a forum. I don't think Chris Mitchell is dishonest in saying it all matters, but ideology, again, it plays a role in the way they do it. And I think it's a terrible thing that Indigenous voices, yet again in Australian history, Indigenous people have sort of fallen out of, they're not listened to again. And so I have a complicated reaction to their reporting of Indigenous affairs, but it is their strength, insofar as I would say anything is a strength of the paper. At least they take it seriously.
But I mean, given the seminal importance of that subject to this country in every way, and given the reality that you mentioned that no other newspaper, indeed no other media, goes anywhere near the coverage that the Australian gives this, surely, flawed though you think it might be, their coverage of Indigenous Australia is vastly better than the alternative.
Yeah, I agree, except that if the coverage is such that serious Australians really come to misunderstand what Aboriginal people are feeling, and if they return to the voicelessness that they had before the 60s, that's not a small thing. And the other thing, which you know I care about, is the way in which they promoted Wind Shuttle. And that was, in my view, a very malign moment in the culture. Really serious, because good Australians, decent Australians, my hero Bill Stanner, but others like Charles Rowley, others like Henry Reynolds, Judith Wright, have made enormous efforts to open the eyes of Australian public opinion to the tragedy of what had happened and what white Australians were responsible for. And promoting Wind Shuttle, I think, did a lot of damage. And now promoting Gary Johns in the same way does a lot of damage to the work that a really fine generation did. So you can see I'm full of ambivalence about that issue.
And on Wind Shuttle, do you think, I mean, you've written at length about this in the past, do you think that their coverage and their approach to it has been entirely ideologically motivated?
Yes. I mean, no. If I can contradict myself. I think it's been largely ideologically motivated, but also what you say is true. They wanted to set the agenda. And they saw when Wind Shuttle came up that there was a part of the conservative Australian public opinion that was dying to hear things are not as bad as the left-wing historians say they are. So it helped them set the agenda. So there was both elements involved. But it was very largely ideological because Wind Shuttle was put into the person showing how the left were fabricators and politically correct. And so it fitted very neatly into the overwhelming sort of or overarching ideological commitment of the paper. So there's both elements, I think.
Another sort of subject, or coupled subjects really, in the essay, which are interesting, is the way the Australian covered and editorialised about the mining tax.
Yeah.
And then also Kevin Rudd, where the editor of the Australian, Chris Mitchell, has a close personal relationship with Kevin Rudd. Do you want to kind of talk about these either separately or the way they're intertwined?
I'll try and talk about them the way they're intertwined. I mean, one of the peculiar things, actually, David Marr, one of our best journalists, made this point in the Monthly recently in an essay. It was Sally Neighbours' essay, quoted David Marr. Chris Mitchell has the capacity to personalise everything. David Marr called that his genius. Well, he had a very personal relationship with Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd was a sort of friend in Queensland, in Brisbane, and then particularly Chris Mitchell's wife at the time, Christine Jackman, was close to Kevin Rudd and Therese Rain. And they became godparents to Chris Mitchell's first child with Christine Jackman. And he helped Rudd get to power. He used the paper, The Australian by now, to do that. They fell out for reasons I speculate about in a big way. And it was both political and personal in ways that are very hard to disentangle, but I think very unhealthy that it was both. And then around, I think they fell out beginning of 2009, but by 2010, I think Mitchell made the decision to kind of destroy the Rudd government. They were wrestling for a year. They attacked him over what I would attack Rudd over giving up on climate change, postponing. But then they decided, I think, that the big issue was the mining tax. They didn't at first. At first, as economic rationalists, they thought it was a good idea. But at a certain point, they threw the resources of their paper on a daily basis into undermining the government on the question of the mining tax, super profits tax. It matters to me enormously because I think it was a great lost opportunity. You now have this two-speed economy, what economists call the Dutch disease, where the currency is forced up. It hits tourism, it hits education. My area, it hits manufacturing. And you lose billions of dollars of potential revenue at a time when any increase in tax revenue is difficult for a government. And there are great things you can do with tax. And it was the Australian, more than any other paper, that just went for this issue. What I do in the essay is analyse day by day the front page of the Australian for 6 or 7 weeks. And they sort of killed off the tax. And what I say is that if BHP Billiton or the Mining Council of Australia had owned the Australian, they couldn't have done a better job. And I think we can now see the tragedy of that. And I think it more than any issue, because the caucus was reading the Australian, because they're the political class, it galvanised, I think, opinion against Rudd. He was too isolated. He knows it himself, I'm sure. But the Australian pushed to the point of the coup. So there's a slight revision of our political history embodied in the essay. And for me, the central question was this remorseless campaign against the mining tax.
We've talked about the impact of, you've talked about the impact of the Australian on Australian politics and outcomes. But what influence do you think the Australian has on the tone and the tenor of our society?
Yeah, I think it has a very bad effect on the quality of debate. I mean, I first noticed it, I think, during the Iraq War, when, I had been a Cold Warrior. I had been a strong supporter of American foreign policy against the Soviet Union. I thought that the arguments about going into Iraq were ridiculous. The idea that Saddam Hussein, a tin pot dictator, threatened the United States or Israel militarily, I thought was ridiculous. But to argue that case, as I did in The Age and Sydney Morning Herald, where I wrote a column at the time, you were subjected not to argument, but to ridicule. I particularly am unkeen on an intelligent person, but I think a very bad influence on the country, Greg Sheridan, and in the editorials, who lampooned anyone who put alternative positions. And there was I think even worse than the position that the Australian ran on the war, was the fact that it created an atmosphere where you were sort of almost a traitor and a fool if you just posed questions about what was happening. And I think the Australian has played that role amongst the intelligentsia of really serious people are lampooned for positions they put. So Tim Flannery is lampooned over climate change, or other people, over the war in Iraq. Carmen Lawrence was lampooned, not listened to, and civility suffers. And I think it's hard to, it's important not to underestimate the degree to which a paper of this bullying, overconfident, aggressive quality can do to public debate. And I think it has suffered, just as in a bigger way, debate in America has suffered because of Fox News. I was shocked when I was in America to see Fox News. Even someone who knows what the Australian is like was shocked at the level of public debate that Fox News helped create. And I think these are really serious matters, because civility and reason and a certain level of respect amongst those who differ seems to me vitally important in a decent culture.
But we see that kind of approach in tabloid newspapers in this country. Are you saying that because it's a broadsheet, serious newspaper that's doing it in that way, in that aggressive way, that it's even worse?
Yes, because in a way the real debates of this kind take place amongst only a certain part of the population, which, the intelligentsia or whatever. So that if Andrew Bolt carries on in the Herald Sun, it does harm. But in a way, no one, I tried to engage with him, which is a big error, but no one really engages with him. They just watch with astonishment at what he does. But you have to engage with the Australian, I think, if you're interested in big debates. And there where you have one side not honouring the kind of atmosphere which allows debate to flourish, the things I've been suggesting about civility and respect, then I think we're all harmed. And I think it's hard to, as it were, make concrete. But I think if I can communicate that to this audience, then I think it's important that we know that we do suffer in that more complicated way because of something like the Australian.
And finally, I mean, this might sound like a kind of gotcha question, and it's not intended that way, but you can deal with it, as I'm sure you will.
I like gotcha questions.
But, I mean, would Australia be better off without the Australian?
Well, I make a joke at the end. It's in cut and paste this morning where they leave out all the sentences. I think Australia would be far better with a new editor, the Australian, and a new owner. In other words, I haven't really gone in hard on the subsidy question because I actually believe in subsidy. I believe a lot of good things are not able to survive in market conditions. So if, let's say, there was a liberal, left liberal son of Rupert Murdoch who was willing to subsidise a paper and to get rid of Chris Mitchell, then having a national paper pitched at a serious level, read by the political class, would be a wonderful thing. Now, it's wishful thinking. Whether we, under present conditions, whether we'd be better off, worse off, I think we'd be better off without it, I have to be honest. But I would hope that a paper like that, maybe with that name, would be able to change in nature. And maybe because Rupert Murdoch won't live forever, and maybe if his empire flourishes, different people will see the advantage of keeping it alive. I don't know. But that's the best answer I can give.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. It's been very interesting.